I can still remember the sound of my father's voice cutting through the silence of that October night in 2008. It wasn't the volume that terrified me, it was the cold finality in his tone. Like he was reading a death sentence. I was 17, sitting at our kitchen table in our modest two-story house on Maple Street in suburban Columbus, Ohio, trying to finish my calculus homework under the flickering fluorescent light that had been broken for months. "Pack your things, Sarah. You're out." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I looked up at him standing in the doorway, his weathered face set in stone, his carpenter's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Behind him, I could see my stepmother Linda lurking in the shadows of the hallway. Her arms crossed, that satisfied smirk playing at the corners of her mouth that I'd grown to despise over the past 3 years. "Dad, what are you talking about?" My voice came out smaller than I intended, betraying the fear that was already creeping up my spine. "What did I do?" He frowned slightly. "That's pretty fast." "We'd need to find a place to move, pack up 20 years of belongings." "I understand it's quick," I said. "But my client is prepared to add a $10,000 bonus for a fast closing. That would bring your total to $385,000. That sealed it." He agreed to the terms, and we shook hands on the deal. As he gathered his papers to leave, he paused at the table. "You know, Miss Morrison, you remind me of someone. Can't put my finger on it, but there's something familiar about you." My heart stopped. For a moment, I thought he'd finally recognized me, that some paternal instinct had kicked in despite everything that had happened between us. "I have one of those faces," I said lightly. He shrugged and headed for the door. "Well, thanks for making this easy. Linda's going to be thrilled." I sat alone at that coffee shop table for a long time after he left, staring at the signed purchase agreement. The house where I'd been born, where I'd taken my first steps and said my first words, where my mother had read me bedtime stories and my father had taught me to tie my shoes. It was finally going to be mine, but the victory felt hollow. I'd imagined this moment so many times over the years, and in my fantasies, there had always been recognition, remorse, some acknowledgement of what he'd done to me. Instead, he'd looked right through me like I was a stranger, then casually mentioned his daughter who'd been nothing but trouble. The closing took place exactly 30 days later at a law office downtown. I arrived early and watched through the conference room window as my father and Linda pulled up in their aging pickup truck. She was dressed in what was clearly her best outfit, a floral dress that looked like it had come from a department store clearance rack. He was wearing a suit that didn't quite fit right, probably purchased specifically for this occasion. They were both nervous and excited, whispering to each other as they walked into the building. This was the biggest financial transaction of their lives. Enough money to fund their retirement and their fresh start. I waited until they were seated at the conference table before I entered the room. "Mr. and Mrs. Cooper," I said, extending my hand. "Sarah Morrison." We spoke on the phone. Linda was a thin woman in her early 50s, with bleached blonde hair and too much makeup. She had the kind of sharp features that could look attractive, or harsh depending on her expression. Today, she was all smiles, Miss Morrison. "We're so excited about this. Dawn's been telling me about your client's development plans. It sounds like it's going to be wonderful for the neighborhood." My father nodded enthusiastically. "Property values should go through the roof. Good thing we're getting out while we can still afford to." The irony was lost on him completely. The closing proceeded smoothly. Papers were signed, funds were transferred, keys were handed over. My father and Linda were giddy with excitement, talking about their new condo and all the activities they'd be able to enjoy. "You know," Linda said as we wrapped up the paperwork, "I'm almost glad this worked out the way it did. That house has too many bad memories anyway. Don's first wife, his difficult daughter. It'll be nice to start fresh somewhere new." "Linda," my father warned, but she waved him off. "Oh, it's fine. I'm sure Miss Morrison understands family drama. Some people are just toxic, you know. You can't let them drag you down forever." I smiled and nodded, playing my role perfectly. Inside, I was cataloging every casual cruelty, every dismissive comment, storing them away for later. After the closing, I drove directly to Maple Street and parked in front of the house that was Now legally mine. I sat in my car for a few minutes just looking at it. The blue paint my father had chosen was starting to fade. The landscaping Linda had installed looked cheap and sparse compared to the lush garden my mother had maintained. I got out of the car and walked up the front steps, my heels clicking on the concrete. The key turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal the hallway where I'd grown up. It was smaller than I remembered, and completely different. The walls had been repainted, the floors refinished, and all the furniture was new. Linda had systematically erased every trace of my mother's influence, replacing warm family touches with generic decor that looked like it came from a furniture store showroom. I walked through each room slowly, remembering what it had been like when it was truly home. The kitchen where my mother had taught me to bake cookies. The living room where we'd watched movies together as a family. The staircase I'd run up and down 1,000 times as a child. In what had been my bedroom, Linda had set up a craft room. The walls were painted a garish pink, and the space was filled with scrapbooking supplies and artificial flowers. My old bed was gone, replaced by a desk covered in ribbon and stickers and other decorative nonsense. I stood in that room for a long time, remembering the night everything had changed. The fear, the confusion, the desperate hope that my father would change his mind. The promise I'd made to myself in the mirror that hung where Linda's motivational posters now decorated the walls. I'd kept that promise. I owned this house, and I owned 11 others on this street. I controlled the neighborhood where I'd been rejected and discarded. I had wealth, success, and power that 17-year-old girl could never have imagined. So why did I feel so empty? My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Rebecca. How did it go? She asked. Did you finally get the house? I got it, I said, walking downstairs and out the front door. I needed fresh air, needed to get away from the ghosts in that house. And how do you feel? I stood on the front porch where I'd said goodbye to my childhood, looking out at the street. I don't know, I admitted. I thought I'd feel from a different, vindicated maybe. Instead, I just feel tired. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Sarah, can I ask you something? What's your plan now? You own the neighborhood. You've proven you could succeed, despite everything that happened to you. What comes next? It was a good question, and I realized I didn't have an answer. For 8 years, everything I'd done had been focused on this moment. This acquisition, this proof that I was worth something. Now that I'd achieved it, I had no idea what I was supposed to do with it. I don't know, I said again. Maybe, Rebecca said gently, it's time to figure out what Sarah Morrison wants, instead of what she's trying to prove. After we hung up, I walked down Maple Street, past the houses I owned, the properties I'd acquired, the neighborhood I'd systematically conquered. It was early evening, and families were coming home from work and school. Children were playing. In yards, couples were walking dogs, teenagers were riding bikes. It was a living, breathing community. And I was its landlord, not its neighbor. I reached the end of the street and turned around, looking back at the house where I'd grown up. A small for rent sign sat in the yard I'd had it installed that morning. In a few days, some other family would move in, create their own memories, make it their home, but it would never be my home again. That was gone forever, not because of real estate transactions or property ownership, but because of the choices my father had made 8 years ago. And maybe if I was being honest with myself, because of the choices I'd made since then, I'd gotten my revenge. I'd proven my worth. I'd kept my promise. Now I had to figure out how to forgive, not my father, who still didn't even know who I was, but myself. For the years I'd spent focused on anger instead of healing. For the relationships I'd avoided because I was too busy building my empire. For the woman I'd become in pursuit of proving I was worthy of love. As I walked back to my car, I passed Mrs. Patterson from the library, now retired and walking her small dog. She smiled at me, and I realized she probably didn't recognize me either. The desperate teenager who'd spent her days in the library was as invisible to her now as I'd been to my father. Maybe that was okay. Maybe some transformations were meant to be complete, permanent, irreversible. But as I drove away from Maple Street for what I knew would be the last time in a very long while, I made myself a new promise. This one had nothing to do with revenge or proving anything to anyone else. This one was about learning to build a life instead of just an empire. About finding out who Sarah Morrison could be when she wasn't trying to punish Donald Cooper. About discovering what happiness looked like when it wasn't defined by someone else's regret. I was 32 years old, successful beyond my wildest teenage dreams, and owner of the street where I'd once been homeless. But I was also alone, angry, and still that 17-year-old girl in a lot of ways that mattered. It was time to grow up for real. Not just financially or professionally, but emotionally. It was time to stop being defined by what had been done to me and start being defined by what I chose to do next. The girl who'd been thrown away was finally ready to stay gone. In her place, a woman was ready to be born, not in reaction to rejection, but in pursuit of genuine happiness. It had taken me 15 years to own Maple Street. Maybe it would take another 15 to truly own myself, but for the first time since that terrible night, when everything changed, I was ready to try. Stepped into the kitchen, his work boots heavy on the linoleum floor that we'd installed together. Just 2 summers ago. Back then, he'd taught me how to measure twice and cut once, how to be patient with the details. Now he couldn't even look me in the eye. Don't play dumb with me, Sarah. Linda told me everything. The drugs she found in your room, the money missing from her purse, the lies you've been telling us about where you go after school. His voice was getting louder now, each accusation hitting me like a slap. I've had enough. I won't have a junkie. Thief living under my roof. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Drugs? Dad, I don't even drink. And I never took any money. This is insane. I stood up so fast my chair toppled backward, clattering against the kitchen cabinets. Linda's lying. Why would you believe her over me? That's when I saw it, the flicker of doubt that crossed his features for just a split second. But Linda was there, sliding up beside him like a snake, her perfectly manicured hand resting on his arm. Double quotes. Don't, honey. Don't let her manipulate you. She's gotten very good at playing the victim. Her voice was saccharine sweet, the same tone she used when she wanted something from him. We talked about this. Tough love is the only way she learned. I watched my father's face harden again, watched him choose her over me for what felt like the 1,000th time since they'd gotten married. My mother had been dead for 4 years, and in that time, Linda had systematically worked to erase every trace of the relationship my father and I had built over 17 years. You've got 1 hour, he said, turning away from me. Take what you can carry. After that, the locks get changed. The finality of it hit me like a freight train. This wasn't a punishment or a lesson, this was exile. Permanent, irreversible exile from the only home I'd ever known. Dad, please. I was crying now, hot tears streaming down my face, but I didn't care about dignity anymore. I'm your daughter. I'm all you have left of Mom. How can you do this to me? He stopped in the doorway, his shoulders rigid. For a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to him. Then Linda whispered something in his ear, and he walked away without another word. I stood there in that kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of better times. The height marks on the doorframe where he'd measured my growth every birthday. The family photos on the refrigerator that Linda had slowly been replacing with pictures of herself. The coffee mug I'd made him in pottery class sitting forgotten on the counter. 1 hour. 17 years of life reduced to whatever I could fit in a backpack. I stumbled up the stairs to my room, my hands shaking as I tried to figure out what a homeless 17-year-old girl might need to survive. Clothes, obviously. My mother's. Jewelry that I'd hidden from Linda's greedy eyes. The emergency cash I'd been saving from my part-time job at the Diner 347. Dollars that suddenly felt like both a fortune and nothing at all. As I packed, I could hear them downstairs, their voices low but urgent. Linda's occasional laugh cut through the murmur like broken glass. She was celebrating. She'd finally won the war she'd been waging against me since the day she'd moved into our house. I grabbed my high school diploma. I'd graduated early.
Thanks.
To taking summer courses and testing out of classes. It was supposed to be my ticket to college, to a better life. Now it felt like a cruel joke. I stuffed it into my backpack along with my birth certificate and social security card. Whatever came next, I'd need those documents. The photographs were the hardest part. I had boxes of them, me and my parents from before the cancer took her, family vacations to Lake Erie, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. I could only take a few, the most precious ones. The rest would stay here, at the mercy of Linda's spring. Cleaning. As I zipped up my backpack, I caught my reflection in the mirror above my dresser. I looked young and scared and completely unprepared for what was about to happen to me. My long brown hair was tangled from running my fingers through it. My green eyes, my mother's eyes, were red and swollen from crying. I was 5'6" and maybe 120 pounds soaking wet. Not exactly built for surviving on the streets, but as I stared at myself, something shifted inside me. The fear was still there, sharp and cold in my chest, but underneath something else was growing. Anger, pure white-hot rage at the injustice of it all, at my father's betrayal, at Linda's cruelty, at a world that would let a 17-year-old girl get thrown away like garbage. I made myself a promise in that mirror, speaking the words aloud in the empty room. I'm going to survive this. I'm going to more than survive, I'm going to thrive. And someday, when I have everything I want and everything I need, I'm going to come back to this street. And I'm going to own it. The hour was almost up. I could hear my father's heavy footsteps on the stairs. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, took one last look around the room where I'd spent my childhood, and walked out the door. He was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs, holding an envelope. Your birth certificate and some cash, he sighed, not meeting my eyes. Don't say I never did anything for you. I took the envelope, our fingers brushing for just a moment. His skin was rough and calloused from years of construction work, the same hands that had braided my hair when I was little, taught me to ride a bike, held me when I cried after my mother died. Dad, I whispered one last time, hoping against hope that he would change his mind, that some part of the man who'd raised me was still in there. He stepped back and opened the front door. Cold October air rushed in, carrying the smell of dying leaves and the promise of winter. You made your choices, Sarah. Now live with them. I walked past him into the night, down the front steps of the house where I'd taken my first steps, said my first words, learned to love and trust and believe. And family. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded like the end of the world. The street was quiet. Most of the houses dark except for the occasional porch light or the blue glow of television screens. I'd walked down this sidewalk thousands of times, to school, to friends' houses, to the corner store for candy. Now every familiar landmark felt like a reproach, a reminder of everything I was losing. I made it to the end of the block before I broke down completely, collapsing onto a bus stop bench and sobbing until my chest hurt. I was 17 years old, homeless, and completely alone in the world. I had less than $400 to my name and nowhere to go. But even as I cried, even as the full weight of my situation crashed down on me, that promise I'd made to myself burned bright in my chest. I would survive this. I would come back stronger. And someday, this whole street, every house, every lot, every inch of ground that had just rejected me would be mine. I just had to figure out how to make it through the night first. The first thing you learn about being homeless is that every single decision becomes a matter of survival. Where to sleep, where to eat, where to shower, where to be safe, questions that had never crossed my mind when I had a home suddenly became the only things that mattered. I spent that first night at a 24-hour McDonald's on High Street, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to look like I belonged there. The fluorescent lights were harsh and unforgiving, making everyone look sick and tired. The overnight crowd was a mix of college students cramming for exams, taxi drivers grabbing quick meals between fares, and people like me, people with nowhere else to go. By 3 in the morning, the manager started giving me suspicious looks. I bought another coffee I couldn't afford and moved to a different table, pretending to study from textbooks I'd stuffed in my backpack. When the sun finally came up, I felt like I'd aged 10 years in one night. The Columbus Public Library became my sanctuary. It opened at 10, and I was there waiting by the doors at 9:30, trying to look like an eager student rather than a desperate teenager with nowhere else to go. Inside, it was warm and quiet and safe. I could use the computers to look for jobs, the bathrooms to wash my face and brush my teeth, and the quiet corners to think and plan and try to figure out my next move. Mrs. Patterson, the librarian who worked the information desk, noticed me after the third day. She was in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You're here early again," she observed. As I settled into my usual spot in the young adult section. "I like to study before the crowds arrive," I lied. Not meeting her eyes, she didn't push, but I caught her watching me throughout the day. When closing time came, she lingered by my table as I slowly packed up my things, clearly reluctant to leave. "Sarah," she said quietly, and I was surprised she knew my name. "I don't know what your situation is, and I won't pry. But there's a youth shelter on Broad Street. Clean, safe, and they don't ask too many questions. Just thought you should know." That night, I swallowed my pride and found the shelter. It was a converted church basement with rows of narrow beds and the constant smell of industrial disinfectant. The other kids ranged in age from 14 to 18, each with their own story of how they'd ended up there. Some had been kicked out like me. Others had run away from abuse. A few had aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. The rules were simple: be back by 9 p.m., no drugs or alcohol, no fighting, no stealing, break the rules and you were banned. It wasn't comfortable, but it was better than McDonald's. I lasted 3 weeks before the nightmares started keeping everyone awake. And they asked me to leave. 3 weeks of lying on a thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to other kids cry themselves to sleep. 3 weeks of wondering if my father ever thought about me, if he regretted his decision. If Linda had finally convinced him I'd never existed at all. Finding work was harder than I'd expected. I had my high school diploma, but no car, no permanent address, and no references beyond my old boss at the diner who'd had to let me go when I couldn't guarantee my schedule anymore. Fast food places wanted someone who could work consistent shifts. Retail stores wanted someone who looked put together and professional. Office jobs wanted experience I didn't have. Finally, I found work at a 24-hour gas station on the rough side of town. The night shift paid an extra $1 an hour, and they were desperate enough not to ask too many questions about why a 17-year-old girl was available to work from midnight to 8 a.m. Carl, the manager, was a heavyset man in his 40s with tired eyes and a 3-day stubble. "You show up on time, you don't steal from the register, and you don't cause trouble with the customers, we'll get along fine," he told me on my first night. "Trouble finds you anyway in this neighborhood, but you don't need to go looking for it." He wasn't wrong. The overnight shift brought in all kinds drunk college kids buying beer they shouldn't have been served, construction workers getting coffee before dawn shifts, and shadier characters who paid for their gas with crumpled bills and avoided eye contact. I learned to keep a baseball bat behind the counter and to trust my instincts about which customers to watch carefully. The pay was minimum wage, $7.25 an hour, which came out to about $1,200 a month if I worked full-time. After taxes, it was barely enough to rent a room in someone's basement, buy groceries, and keep my phone active. There was nothing left over for emergencies, let alone college or building any kind of real future, but I was surviving. That had to count for something. I found a room in a boarding house on the east side of Columbus. My landlord, Mrs. Chen, was a tiny woman in her 70s who spoke broken English but had sharp eyes that missed nothing. The room was 8 feet by 10 feet, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. We shared a bathroom with 5 other tenants, and the kitchen was off-limits except for designated mealtimes. "First month, last month, and deposit," Mrs. Chun had said when I inquired about the room. "No parties, no drugs, no overnight guests. You pay late, you're out." It cost me $400 a month, which left me with about $800 for everything else. I learned to shop at discount grocery stores, buying generic brands and whatever was on sale. Ramen noodles, peanut butter sandwiches, and canned soup became my primary food groups. I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, but I was making it work. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the constant worry about money. The hardest part was the isolation. At 17, I should have been going to prom, worrying about college applications, hanging out with friends on weekends. Instead, I was working nights and sleeping days, living in a world completely separate from my former classmates, who were posting pictures of their senior year adventures on social media. I tried not to think about my father, but late at night, when I couldn't sleep, my mind would wander back to Maple Street. Was he happy with his decision? Did he miss me at all? Had Linda completely erased me from their lives? Or did he sometimes look at the empty chair at the dinner table and wonder if he'd made a mistake? The anger kept me going when everything else failed. Every time someone looked at me like I was trash, every time a potential employer dismissed me without really listening, every time I had to choose between buying lunch or keeping my phone connected, it all fed the fire burning inside me. I would not let this be my story. I would not disappear into the margins of society and be forgotten. During my breaks at the gas station, I started reading everything I could find about business and finance. The internet was a treasure trove of information for someone willing to dig deep enough. I learned about real estate, about investing, about building credit and creating wealth. Most of it seemed impossible from where I sat, but I absorbed it all anyway, filing it away for someday when I'd have more than survival to worry about. 3 months into my new life, I was walking to work when I saw a familiar figure coming out of a restaurant downtown. It was my father wearing a suit I'd never seen before, laughing at something Linda was saying as they walked to their car. She was dressed up too, in a red dress that probably cost more than I made in a month. They looked happy, prosperous, like they were celebrating something. I ducked into a doorway before they could see me, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. He looked older than I remembered, with more gray in his hair, but he also looked lighter, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, the weight of me, I realized. Getting rid of me had freed him to be happy with his new wife. I stood in that doorway long after their car had disappeared, tears streaming down my face. Not tears of sadness this time, tears of rage, so pure and focused it felt like swallowing fire. He was out there living his best life while I was scraping by in a boarding house room, working nights at a gas station, eating ramen noodles for dinner, but he wouldn't be happy forever. And someday, when I had built something real and substantial and powerful, I would make sure he knew exactly what he had thrown away. I would make sure he understood that discarding me was the biggest mistake of his life. I walked the rest of the way to work with my head held high, that promise burning brighter than ever in my chest. This was just the beginning. The hardest part was behind me now. I had learned to survive. Now it was time to learn how to thrive. The turning point came on a Tuesday night in February, about 6 months after I'd been kicked out. I was working my usual overnight shift at the gas station when a well-dressed woman in her 40s came in around 3 a.m., looking frazzled and desperate. "Please tell me you have a phone charger that fits this," she said, pulling out an iPhone with a cracked screen. "My car broke down about a mile from here and my phone is dead. I need to call for help." We didn't sell phone chargers, but I had one that fit behind the counter. I'd learned to keep my phone charged at all times, since it was my only connection to the world. "You can use mine," I offered, plugging her phone into the wall while we waited for it to charge enough to make a call. She told me her story. Her name was Rebecca Martinez, and she was a real estate agent who'd been showing a house to a late-night client when her car had broken down. She'd been walking for 20 minutes in heels, looking for help. "You're a lifesaver," she said, finally able to call a tow truck. While we waited for them to arrive, we talked. She was curious about why someone my age was working overnight shifts, and I found myself telling her an abbreviated version of my story, without the details about drugs and theft accusations that weren't true. "Kicked out at 17 for something you didn't do," she repeated, shaking her head. "That's rough, kid. But you seem to have your head on straight. Working, paying your own way, not making excuses. That says something about your character." When the tow truck arrived, she handed me her business card. I meant what I said about your character. I'm always looking for reliable people who aren't afraid of hard work. If you ever want to learn about real estate, give me a call. I tucked the card into my pocket and forgot about it for 2 weeks. Then Carl announced that the gas station was closing. The owner was selling the property to developers who wanted to build condos. I had 2 weeks to find another job. Finding work was just as hard the second time around. The restaurant industry wanted day availability, retail wanted weekend shifts, and most night jobs were in even rougher neighborhoods than where I'd been working. After a week of rejections, I remembered Rebecca's card. I called her on a Thursday morning, expecting to leave a voicemail. She answered on the second ring. "Sarah, I was hoping you'd call. Are you still looking for a change?" We met at a coffee shop downtown that afternoon. Rebecca was even more put together in daylight sharp business suit. Perfect makeup, an aura of success that I envied desperately. But she was also warm and genuine, and she listened when I talked. "Here's the thing about real estate," she explained. "It's not easy, especially starting out. You'll work long hours, deal with difficult people, and go weeks without making a sale. But if you stick with it, if you really commit to learning the business, you can build something significant. Financial independence, career growth, the works." The catch was that I need to get my real estate license, which required taking classes and passing a state exam. The course cost $800, which might as well have been $8,000 given my financial situation. But Rebecca offered to loan me the money, to be paid back for my first few commissions. "Why?" I asked. "Why would you take a chance on me?" She was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Because I see something in you that reminds me of myself at your age. I was 19 when I started in real estate, fresh out of a bad marriage, completely broke, and scared out of my mind. Someone took a chance on me, and it changed my life. Now I want to pay it forward." I took the real estate course at night after working day shifts at a temp agency that paid just enough to cover my room and basic expenses. The material was challenging contract law, property rights, financing options, market analysis, but I was hungry for it. After months of feeling like I was just treading water, I finally had something that felt like a real opportunity. I passed the licensing exam on my first try, scoring in the top 10%. Rebecca celebrated by taking me out to dinner at a nice restaurant downtown, the first real meal I'd had in months that didn't come from a can or a microwave. "Welcome to Martina's Real Estate," she said, raising her glass of wine. "You're officially my newest agent." The first year was brutal. Real estate is a commission-only business, which means no sales equals no income. I went 3 months without a single closing, surviving on the small salary Rebecca paid me for administrative work around the office. I showed houses to clients who weren't serious about buying, wrote offers that got rejected, and watched other agents close deals while I struggled to understand what I was doing wrong. But slowly, gradually, I started to figure it out. Real estate isn't just about showing houses, it's about understanding people. What they really want versus what they say they want. What motivates them to buy, what holds them back, how to guide them through the biggest financial decision of their lives. My first sale was a small condo to a young couple just starting out. The commission was only $2,800, but it felt like winning the lottery. For the first time since I'd been kicked out, I had more than a few $100s to my name.
"This
is just the beginning," Rebecca told me as she handed me the commission check. "You've got natural instincts for this business. Now we just need to sharpen them." She was right. Over the next 2 years, I steadily built my client base and my reputation. I specialized in working with first-time homebuyers, young couples, single professionals, people who reminded me of myself trying to build something from nothing. I understood their fears and their dreams because I'd lived them. By my 3rd year in real estate, I was one of the top agents in Rebecca's office. I'd moved out of Mrs. Chun's boarding house and into a small apartment of my own. I had a reliable car, professional clothes, and a savings account that was actually growing instead of constantly emptying. But more importantly, I was learning about the business behind the business. How property values worked, what drove neighborhood development, how to spot undervalued areas before they became hot markets. I started small, buying a rundown duplex in an up-and-coming area, fixing it up on weekends, and renting it out for more than my mortgage payment. The duplex led to another property, then another. I was reinvesting every penny I made, living as cheaply as possible while building a portfolio of rental properties. Other agents were buying new cars and taking expensive vacations. I was buying buildings. "You're obsessed," Rebecca observed one afternoon as I showed her my latest acquisition on paper, a small apartment building that needed significant renovations but was priced well below market value.
"I'm focused," I corrected. "There's a difference."
She studied me for a moment, and I could see the concern in her eyes. "Sarah, you're 23 years old. When's the last time you went on a date? Or took a weekend off? You're building wealth, which is great, but you're not building a life." I knew she was right, but I also knew something she didn't. Every property I bought, every dollar I saved, every deal I closed was bringing me closer to my ultimate goal. I hadn't forgotten the promise I'd made to myself that night on Maple Street. I was going to own that street someday, every house and every lot. And I was going to make sure my father knew exactly who he'd thrown away. The real breakthrough came when I started tracking property sales in my old neighborhood. Columbus was growing. Young professionals were moving to the suburbs, and property values were rising steadily. My childhood street was in a particularly desirable area, good schools, established neighborhood, close to downtown but still suburban enough for families. I drove by the house where I'd grown up for the first time in 5 years. It looked smaller than I remembered, but well maintained. My father had painted it a different color blue instead of the white it had been when I lived there. Linda's influence, no doubt. The garden my mother had loved was gone, replaced with low-maintenance shrubs and mulch. As I sat in my car looking at the house, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger or sadness, but a cold, calculating satisfaction. I was no longer the desperate 17-year-old girl who'd been thrown out with nothing but a backpack. I was a successful real estate agent with a growing property portfolio and the knowledge to make my childhood promise a reality. It was time to start phase 2 of my plan. Over the next 8 months, I quietly began acquiring properties on and around Maple Street. Not obviously, I used different LLCs and worked through other agents to avoid drawing attention. A retired couple looking to downsize, a job transfer forcing a quick sale, an estate sale after an elderly neighbor passed away. One by one, I was buying my childhood neighborhood. The strategy required patience and careful planning. I couldn't just make offers on every property at once. That would drive up prices and alert other investors to what I was doing. Instead, I waited for natural opportunities and positioned myself to be the first buyer they called. By my 7th year in real estate, at age 25, I owned 12 of the 34 houses on Maple Street and the surrounding blocks. My property portfolio was worth over $2 million, and the rental income from my buildings was enough to support my lifestyle while I continued to reinvest and grow, but the crown jewel was still out of reach. My father and Linda were still living in the house where I'd grown up, apparently happy and settled. I drove by occasionally to check on the property, always careful not to be seen. They'd made more improvements over the years: a new roof, updated windows, a deck in the backyard where the old swing set used to be. I could have approached them directly, made an offer to buy the house. But that wasn't the point. This was never just about real estate, it was about justice. About proving that throwing me away was the worst decision my father had ever made. I wanted him to come to me, and eventually he would, because I wasn't just buying houses anymore. I was reshaping an entire neighborhood. And when the transformation was complete, when I controlled every property that mattered, he would have no choice but to face what he'd lost when he chose Linda over his own daughter. The girl he'd discarded was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who owned the ground he walked on. The call came on a gray Monday morning in March, 8 years after I'd been kicked out of my childhood home. I was in my downtown office. I'd opened my own real estate firm 2 years earlier, Martinez Cooper Realty, in partnership with Rebecca, when my assistant buzzed me. "Sarah, there's a Donald Cooper on line 2. Says it's about property on Maple Street." I stared at the phone for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. Cooper was my father's last name, the name I'd stopped using the day I'd been thrown out. I'd legally changed it to Morrison, my mother's maiden name, as soon as I'd been able to afford the court fees. "Tell him I'll call him back," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I needed a minute to think, to prepare myself for whatever this conversation was going to be. I walked to the window of my 20th floor office and looked out over Columbus, at the city where I'd built my new life from nothing. My reflection in the glass showed a woman in a tailored business suit, with confident shoulders and careful makeup. I looked successful, powerful, untouchable. I looked nothing like the broken 17-year-old girl who'd sat on that bus stop bench 8 years ago. After 10 minutes, I called him back, Donald Cooper speaking. His voice was exactly as I remembered, it gruff, impatient, the voice that had told me to pack my things and get out. "This is Sarah Morrison from Morrison Real Estate," I said, using the business name I'd registered for my personal property investments. "I understand you have property on Maple Street you'd like to discuss." There was a pause that stretched between us like a chasm carved by 8 years of silence. Abandonment and unspoken pain, a void filled with everything I'd wanted to say. To him, every sleepless night I'd spent wondering if he ever thought about what he'd done. Every moment of doubt when I'd questioned whether I really was the monster he'd painted me to be. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick with the weight of history and betrayal, until he finally broke it with words that carried the bone-deep weariness of a man who'd been fighting battles he didn't understand, consequences he'd never bothered to trace back to their source. "Yeah, that's right," he said, his voice rougher than I remembered, gravelly from years of cigarettes and construction dust and the accumulated stress of choices that had come home to roost. "Look, I don't know what kind of game is being played here, but someone's been systematically buying up the whole neighborhood. House by house, block by block, like some kind of chess match where the rest of us are just pawns. My property taxes have tripled in the past 2 years alone, tripled. And now I'm getting letters every damn week from developers wanting to buy my house. Some offering cash, others promising quick closings, all of them circling like vultures. It's like they smell blood in the water, like they know exactly how desperate we're getting." I pulled up his file on my computer, my fingers trembling slightly, almost imperceptibly. I hoped as I typed his address into the system. Each keystroke felt like a small act of violence, a tiny revenge enacted one character at a time. The house where I'd taken my first tentative steps as a toddler, where I'd blown out birthday candles surrounded by my parents' love, where I'd cried myself to sleep after my mother's funeral while my father held my hand and promised we'd get through it together. That house, saturated with memories both beautiful and devastating, was now worth $340,000 according to the cold, clinical assessment of the real estate market. The number represented more than just an increase from the modest $180,000 it had been appraised at just 5 years ago. It represented the mathematical precision of my revenge, the careful orchestration of financial pressure that had taken me years to perfect, the property tax increases he was complaining about with such obvious frustration and bewilderment, the financial vice that was slowly squeezing the life out of him and his precious new wife, were the direct and entirely intentional result of my strategic purchases methodically driving up neighborhood values. Every acquisition had been calculated with surgical precision, every dollar spent with the cold efficiency of a chess grandmaster moving pieces into position for checkmate. I'd studied the tax assessment patterns, understood how comparable sales affected property valuations, learned to manipulate the system with the same ruthless intelligence that had carried me from homeless teenager to successful businesswoman. Each house I'd bought had been chosen not just for its investment potential, but for its specific impact on the tax burden of 1247 Maple Street, the address that was burned into my memory like a brand. "Real estate markets can be unpredictable," I said carefully, each word measured and professional despite the hurricane of emotions churning in my chest, despite the way my heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it across the small table. Gentrification often happens in waves, especially in neighborhoods with good bones and convenient locations. Areas that have been overlooked for years can suddenly become hot commodities when the right combination of factors align. What exactly are you looking for, Mr. Cooper? What would represent a solution to your current situation? He ran a weathered hand through his graying hair, and I found myself cataloging every change the years had wrought on the man who'd once seemed invincible to my child's eyes. The gesture was familiar. I'd seen him do it countless times when he was frustrated or overwhelmed, but the hand itself was different now. More gnarled, the knuckles swollen with arthritis from decades of physical labor. I noticed the wedding ring that had replaced the simple gold band he'd worn with my mother, the ring I'd helped him pick out for their 10th anniversary when I was 12 years old. This new one was wider, more ornate, probably Linda's choice. Probably selected to make a statement about her ownership of the man who'd once been mine to love and trust. I want to know who's behind this, he said, his voice taking on an edge of desperation that I'd never heard before, not even during the worst of the fights with Linda that had preceded my exile. And I want to know if they're interested in my property, because frankly, Linda and I can't afford to keep living here anymore. We're both pushing 60, and these tax bills are eating us alive like some kind of financial cancer. Last month's bill was more than my mortgage payment used to be, more than we used to spend on groceries for 3 months. It's insane, it's unsustainable, and I don't understand how it happened so fast. The irony was so perfect, so exquisitely, and cosmically cruel that it took my breath away and made my heart race with a mixture of vindication and anguish that threatened to overwhelm my carefully constructed professional facade. My father, the man who'd thrown me out onto the streets at 17 for allegedly stealing money that I'd never touched, never even thought about taking, was now being systematically and methodically priced out of his own neighborhood by his own daughter. The child he'd discarded like garbage, thrown away with less consideration than he'd give to an old piece of furniture, had grown up to become the invisible architect of his displacement, the puppet master pulling strings he couldn't even see. The poetic justice was almost too much to bear, so symmetrical and complete that it felt like the universe itself had conspired to give me this moment. But underneath the satisfaction, there was something else, a hollow ache that I hadn't expected. A grief for the relationship we'd once had, for the father who'd existed before Linda's poison had infected his mind and heart. This man across from me, worried about money and taxes and his future security, was the same man who'd taught me to change a tire in the driveway, who'd stayed up all night with me when I had pneumonia when I was 8, who'd cried with me at my mother's graveside and promised that nothing would ever change between us. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. I might have a client who'd be very interested, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside me, despite the way every word felt like it was being torn from my throat. They've been acquiring properties in your area, specifically targeting houses with particular characteristics and potential. The offers have been quite competitive from what I understand. Would you be available to meet this afternoon to discuss terms and possibilities in more detail? We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop downtown at 3 o'clock neutral territory, where neither of us had any shared memories or emotional connections, where the ghosts of our past couldn't intrude on the business at hand. I chose the location carefully, a place I'd never been with him, somewhere that belonged entirely to the present rather than the past. I spent the next few hours in my corner office high above the city, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the urban landscape I'd conquered through sheer force of will and an almost supernatural capacity for patience and planning. The view stretched for miles, encompassing neighborhoods where I owned property, buildings where my investments generated steady returns, streets where my influence shaped the very fabric of economic reality. I prepared mentally and emotionally for a conversation I'd been imagining, rehearsing, and simultaneously dreading for 8 long years. In my fantasies, this moment had played out in dozens of different ways. Sometimes he'd recognize me immediately and break down in tears, begging for forgiveness and trying to explain how he'd been manipulated and deceived. Sometimes he'd see me and fly into a rage, accusing me of orchestrating some elaborate revenge scheme. Sometimes he'd look right through me as if I were invisible, and I'd have to decide whether to reveal my identity or let him remain ignorant of the true nature. of his circumstances. How would he react when he realized who I was? Would there be recognition flickering in his eyes like a slowly dawning sunrise, followed by the complex succession of emotions, guilt, regret, shame, maybe even a desperate attempt at justification? Or would he look right through me like I was just another stranger in a business suit? The daughter he'd erased from his life, now invisible to him, a non-person who'd never existed in any meaningful way. The uncertainty was almost worse than any specific outcome I could imagine. I changed clothes twice, finally settling on a navy blue suit that projected authority and success without being too flashy or intimidating. I wanted to look powerful but approachable, successful but not untouchable. The suit had cost more than he probably made in a month, but I didn't want it to be obviously expensive. I wanted him to see a competent professional, someone who could solve his problems, not someone who might make him feel inadequate or suspicious. I practiced different ways to reveal my identity, different opening lines that would shatter his comfortable illusions and force him to confront the reality of what he'd done. But in the end, I decided to let the moment unfold naturally, to see how long it would take for the man who'd raised me for 16 years to recognize the woman I'd become despite his best efforts to destroy me. I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, using the time to study the layout and choose my position strategically. I selected a corner table where I could see the entrance clearly, where I could watch him walk in and compose myself before he spotted me. The table was positioned so that the afternoon light would illuminate his face while leaving mine partially in shadow, a small psychological advantage that might help me maintain control of the situation. The cafe was busy with the usual afternoon crowd business, people grabbing quick meetings between appointments, students hunched over laptops, with textbooks spread around them like fortifications, couples sharing quiet conversations over lattes and pastries. Normal people living normal lives, going about their daily routines completely unaware that they were about to witness a confrontation 8 years in the making. A reckoning that had been building like pressure in a geological fault line. At exactly 3 o'clock, he'd always been punctual, a trait I'd inherited along with his stubbornness and his capacity for holding grudges. My father walked through the glass doors, and for a moment that felt like an eternity suspended in amber, I forgot how to breathe. Time seemed to collapse like a folding telescope, and I was simultaneously the successful businesswoman I'd become and the broken 17-year-old girl who'd been thrown away like trash, standing on the sidewalk with a garbage bag full of clothes and nowhere to go. The two versions of myself existed in the same space, the same moment, creating a disorienting double exposure of past and present that made me dizzy with vertigo. He looked so much older than I'd expected, aged beyond what 8 years should have accomplished. There was significantly more gray in his hair, which was thinner now and receding at the temples in a way that made his forehead seem larger, more prominent. The deep lines that had etched themselves around his eyes and mouth weren't just the natural progression of aging. They were the kind of lines that came from years of worry and stress, from carrying burdens that weighed on a person's soul. His shoulders, which I remembered as broad and strong, capable of lifting me up to reach high shelves or carrying me to bed when I fell asleep on the couch, now seemed slightly stooped, as if the weight of his choices had literally bent him forward.
He moved with the careful, deliberate gait of someone whose body had been worn down by decades of construction work and the accumulated weight of guilt.
He might not even consciously acknowledge, but despite all the changes, despite the years that had weathered and diminished him, he was still unmistakably my father, still the man who taught me to ride a bike on the sidewalk outside our house, running alongside me with his hand on the seat until I was steady enough to go on my own. Still the man who'd helped me with math homework at the kitchen table, patiently explaining long division until I finally understood. Still the man who'd held me tight when I cried after my mother's funeral and promised me that everything would be okay, that we'd take care of each other no matter what, that our family might be smaller now, but it was still strong, still unbreakable. The contradiction between the man I remembered and the man who'd thrown me away was so stark, so incomprehensible, that for a moment I wondered if I'd somehow gotten it wrong, if there was some explanation I'd missed, some piece of the puzzle that would make it all make sense. But then I remembered Linda's triumphant smile the day I left. The way she'd stood in the doorway watching me walk away with my trash bag of belongings, and I knew that my memories were accurate. My pain was justified, my anger was righteous. He spotted me sitting alone at the corner table and walked over with measured steps, his work boots clicking against the polished concrete floor. He extended his hand with a practiced, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile he'd probably perfected over years of dealing with potential clients and difficult customers. Miss Morrison, Don Cooper, thanks for taking the time to meet with me on such short notice. I really appreciate you fitting me into your schedule. I shook his hand, the same calloused hand that had once bandaged my scraped knees with infinite gentleness. That had taught me how to hold a hammer properly and swing it with confidence, studying his face intently for any flicker of recognition, any sign that some part of him remembered the child he'd raised. His grip was still strong despite the arthritis I could see in his knuckles, still the firm handshake of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. There was absolutely nothing in his expression, no spark of familiarity, no moment of confusion or double take. To him, I was just another real estate agent in a business suit, another stranger in the endless parade of people trying to profit from his misfortune. The daughter he'd thrown away, the child he'd once claimed to love more than his own life, had been so completely erased from his memory and consciousness that she might as well have never existed. The completeness of his non-recognition was almost more devastating than his rejection had been 8 years ago. At least then, I'd been real to him, present enough to inspire his anger and disappointment. Now I was nothing, a blank space where a daughter should have been, a non-person whose entire existence had been successfully edited out of his personal narrative. "Please sit down," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me with what I hoped was a warm, professional smile that betrayed none of the emotional chaos raging beneath the surface. "I appreciate you coming all the way downtown. The traffic can be brutal this time of day. Tell me about your situation, what you're hoping to accomplish, what would represent an ideal outcome for you and your wife." He settled into the chair with a slight grunt, the kind of unconscious sound middle-aged men make when their bodies remind them they're not young anymore, when years of physical labor have taken their toll on joints and muscles. He looked around the cafe briefly, taking in the exposed brick walls and industrial lighting, the kind of deliberately casual decor that signaled expensive coffee and a clientele with disposable income. "Nice place," he said, though his tone suggested he found it a bit pretentious. "Linda would like this. She's always after me to try new places, expand our horizons." The casual mention of his wife's name hit me like a slap, even though I'd been expecting it. Linda, the woman who'd systematically poisoned his mind against me, who'd seen a grieving teenager as competition for attention and resources, who'd orchestrated my exile with the calculating precision of a master manipulator. The woman who was now reaping the benefits of his decision, while remaining blissfully unaware that his discarded daughter had grown up to become the invisible force, destroying their comfortable retirement plans. He launched into his story with the weary tone of someone who'd been telling it repeatedly to anyone who would listen, the rising property taxes that were bleeding him dry month by month, the relentless pressure from developers who called at all hours of the day and night, stuffing his mailbox with increasingly generous offers that both tempted and terrified him. His voice carried a mixture of resignation and frustration that I'd never heard from him before. The sound of a man who'd lost control of his own life and couldn't understand how it had happened. "It started about 3 years ago," he said, warming to his subject as he settled into the familiar rhythm of complaint and explanation. "Just little increases at first, the kind of thing you grumble about but can manage. Then it started accelerating. Every assessment brought a bigger jump, and the explanations never made sense. They'd talk about comparable sales and market improvements, but I'd drive around the neighborhood and I couldn't see what was so different. Sure, a few houses got sold, a few got fixed up, but nothing that justified the kind of increases we were seeing." I nodded sympathetically, making occasional notes on my tablet, while internally marveling at his complete obliviousness to the carefully orchestrated campaign I'd been waging against his financial Stability. Every house I purchased and renovated. Every strategic improvement that raised comparable values. Every calculated move in my elaborate chess game, he'd noticed the effects without ever connecting them to a larger pattern, much less imagining that they might be directed specifically at him. The breaking point came 6 months ago, he continued, his voice taking on the bitter edge of someone who'd been pushed past their limit. The tax bill came in and it was double what we'd paid. The year before, double. Linda sat at the kitchen table with the calculator, running the numbers over and over, trying to figure out how we were supposed to manage it on our income. We're both trying to transition toward retirement, working fewer hours, setting aside what we can, and suddenly we're facing tax bills that are higher than our mortgage used to be. The satisfaction I'd expected to feel at hearing about his financial distress was complicated by an unexpected pang of something that might have been sympathy. This was the man who'd raised me, who'd sacrificed to give me piano lessons in summer camps, who'd worked overtime to pay for my mother's medical bills and funeral expenses. The part of me that had once been his daughter, before Linda's poison had infected his mind, couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness at seeing him reduced to this a man in his late 50s, worried about money and security, forced to consider abandoning the home where he'd built his life, years later. I returned to the house where my father had thrown me out, not as his daughter, but as a successful professional ready to buy the very home he could no longer afford. During our conversation, he didn't recognize me. Instead, he spoke coldly about the daughter he used to have, painting me as a drug addict, a liar, a thief, someone he had to cut out of his life for the sake of his new wife. He erased who I really was, a grieving, broken 17-year-old girl who had lost her mother and was never given the chance to heal. I listened silently, hiding behind the mask of a calm real estate agent. Every word hit like a slap, but I stayed composed. When he said my name, Sarah, with such contempt, I realized he'd rewritten the past so completely that even he might believe his own lies. That was the only way he could live with what he did. We negotiated like strangers. I offered him far more than the house was worth, not out of kindness, but strategy. The same man who once left me with nothing now eagerly signed over everything, thinking it was his lucky day. In 30 days, the house would be mine, the very street where he discarded me. Now, I own it, and me? I smiled, because sometimes revenge doesn't scream. Sometimes it signs a contract and walks away in silence.